1969 through 1989 was a time of great tension between the Soviet Union and the United States. Presidents were pressured to establish strong and clear foreign policies to combat communism. The two most significant presidents of this time, Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, established two very different types of foreign policy, despite being both Republicans. Richard Nixon was inaugurated on January 20th, 1969. For years, Nixon had watched on as the presidents before him failed to end the tension between the Soviet Union and the U.S. In an attempt to reduce these tensions, Nixon developed the policy known as détente, meaning relaxation of tension in French. During his presidency, Nixon sought to improve relations with the Soviets and also reduce the nuclear arsenals to lessen the chance of war. Earlier this month, we were able to catch up with local foreign policy expert at St. Christopher's School, Mr. Abbott.
What is so interesting about Nixon's foreign policy is that it is surprisingly liberal for a Republican president. Some of Nixon's Republican counterparts were actually opposed to his foreign policy of détente.
In May 1972, Nixon became the first president to visit Moscow. Nixon met with Soviet Secretary General Leonid Brezhnev and signed an array of treaties, including the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the SALT I Treaty. The SALT I Treaty reduced the nuclear arsenals of both the United States and the Soviet Union, which decreased the chance of war and lowered the tension between the two nations. However, many believe that the Soviets were not taking treaties as seriously as they should. Although the treaties were designed to lower the tensions, both countries remained very skeptical of each other's activities. The détente policy did not end after Nixon resigned. His successor, Gerald Ford, continued to pursue détente and even kept the same foreign policy advisors from Nixon's administration. Jimmy Carter also tried to continue détente by signing the SALT II Treaty with Leonid Brezhnev. However, just 6 months later, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, thus bringing an end to the period of détente. This began a new era of foreign policy for the United States. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, he established a much more direct and aggressive stance towards the Soviets. He made a huge statement to the Soviet Union in his Evil Empire speech in Orlando, Florida. In his speech, Reagan labeled the Soviet Union as an evil empire and famously stated that the reality is that we must find peace through strength. This new aggressive approach was the complete opposite of the former détente policy.
In order to cripple the Soviet Union, Reagan decreased Soviet access to technology and depressed the value of Soviet commodities in the global market. He also increased defense spending by 41% and drastically reduced funding for entitlement programs. Reagan believed that by focusing the budget on defense, the United States would always have a military advantage on the Soviet Union. Although he was sometimes provocative with his threats, many experts believed that he was simply showing his military superiority and had no intention of warfare. Reagan found a breakthrough in 1985 when Mikhail Gorbachev became the Secretary General of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was surprisingly liberal and wanted to create reforms in the Soviet Union. He developed a new policy of perestroika, which called for the development of democracy and self-government. He also developed a glasnost policy which allowed freedom of speech. Reagan saw an opportunity through Gorbachev, and he quickly established a strong relationship with him. In 1987, Gorbachev traveled to Washington, D.C., where he signed the INF Treaty. This treaty eliminated the use of both American and Soviet short-range to mid-range missiles. This was the first time that the two countries had agreed to eliminate weapons and not just put limits on them. After years of negotiations, Gorbachev agreed to withdraw troops from Afghanistan in 1988. 3 years later, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, and the former Eastern Bloc nations overthrew their communist leaders. In the same year, the 12 republics that formed the Soviet Union declared independence, thus dissolving the Soviet Union. The Cold War presented a nightmare for foreign policy makers in the United States. Although both Nixon and Reagan suffered their ups and downs during their presidencies, they were both able to prevent nuclear warfare.